Hello, this is Alex, also known as Solinus Dracone, and welcome back to my Pern Primer series, episode 4. So, today is going to be the last day of discussing the history of Pern, or at least the part pertaining to the settlers. After this video, episodes are going to focus on the organization of the planet's people as it came to be by the point of the Ninth Pass. I suppose I should get this particular detail out of the way while I'm at it. A pass is the name given by the Pernese to the period of roughly 50 years in which the red star's orbit swoops into the Ruckbat system proper and thread falls upon Pern. The time between passes, roughly 200 years, is referred to as an interval. There have been some cases where a pass didn't actually happen, something to do with the erratic nature of the red star's orbit, and then you would have a long interval. Long intervals were roughly 400 years. As of the Ninth Pass, there are only 2 known occurrences of this. When last we left off, I discussed how the dragons came to be. Quick recap. They were bioengineered giant versions of a native species called fire lizards. One thing I should point out, because I'm not entirely certain I made this clear in the last episode, the fire lizards were indeed capable of some limited telepathy. They could transmit images and emotions to their owners. The dragons also had this ability to communicate with their riders. Because the intelligence of the dragons was made to be so much greater than the fire lizards, dragons actually telepathically communicated with each other and with their riders. That is what I meant by saying thinking in words. It meant that the dragons could actually speak with their riders and hold conversations telepathically. Dragons could also speak to people who weren't their riders, but it was rare because dragons don't often have any reason to want to do so. I also made a big point of indicating the potential sexualities of the dragon riders. I may have been a bit OTT in saying how likely it was for any specific rider color to be bi or gay. Each individual person had their own individual personalities after all. What I will say, as a sort of clarification, is that the lower down the ranks of color the rider was, the greater their likelihood to be bi or homosexual. From nigh on improbable in the bronzes, to a 50-50 chance roughly in the greens. This doesn't mean that if you impressed a green dragon you turned gay, or if you were gay and impressed a bronzed you turned straight. It's just an indication of the types of partners the various colored dragons would prefer to have. If you were an alpha male, you were more likely to get a bronze or a brown. If you were gay or bi, you were probably going to get a blue or a green. If you were going to get a dragon at all, that is. Anyhow, I brought up the subject of sexuality because in these books, sexuality is definitely a thing. It isn't all-out Game of Thrones levels of eroticism, but I would certainly classify these books as PG-13. Sex happens. It doesn't get into the messy details of it, and it isn't even remotely pornographic, but sex definitely is a thing in the Dragon Riders of Pern series. It isn't sidestepped around or vaguely alluded to. If you have children whom you don't want to expose to sexuality, or you yourself don't want to encounter any form of sexuality, then avoid these books, and probably avoid the internet. Back to the story! Not long after the dragons hatched, the settlement of Landing became too dangerous to live in anymore. Not only was it harder to keep people safe because the southern continent in general had a great deal of broad open ground, but a volcano nearby had become much more active. The colonists, still possessive of a pretty decent level of modern technology, were able to detect this and safely evacuate Landing prior to the eruption. The entire settlement became covered in ash, Pompeii style. Nobody could live there anymore. So the colonists decided that they would move their entire civilization to the northern continent. While it was considerably smaller, it was much more stable, volcanically speaking, and the whole thing was just jam-packed with mountain ranges, which meant caves. Since thread couldn't penetrate through stone, living in caves made sense. But these were no simple, disgusting, dingy holes in the ground. They weren't hobbit holes either. It was entirely possible with the size of some of the larger caves to comfortably shelter a population of thousands with full amenities. The colonists were capable of digging sewage lines and tapping into geothermal vents to make hot water. They were perfectly capable of making this life work. With the aid of the dragons and also a massive fleet of boats, the colonists made an epic crossing from south to north, Dunkirk style. In fact, one of the books mentions Dunkirk in comparison to the situation. Isn't it great when real history makes its way into science fiction? It took a couple weeks, and it definitely wasn't without loss, but it happened. They made it. And the spot where they resettled, the largest cave system on the northern continent, was called Fort. This is the precise point in which the strictly historical portion ends. If you want the greater details, go read the books. What I will say is that Pern began to rearrange itself. At first, everybody lived at Fort, but it soon became clear that dragon riders would not really be able to live amongst the others. Once a rider impressed a dragon, they became an entirely different sort of person. Being a dragon rider meant that a person would always have someone to seek comfort in. A dragon was a rider's soulmate. They could share anything with them, any worry, any feeling. Impression came with a massive boost in confidence because of this. No dragon rider could ever be tyrannized again. A rider's entire personality could change. Also, dragons mated. And when dragons mated, they didn't keep their feelings to themselves. Their emotions broadcast telepathically, and not just the riders could feel it. This could cause quite a few people within range of the mating flight to become pretty randy themselves. This could lead to trouble, as you can probably guess. Because of these things, dragon riders needed to find separate housing. The first riders found an extinct volcano in the mountains north of Fort, and decided to settle there. It was perfect for them. Even though it was almost inaccessible from land, that didn't matter, because dragons could fly and go between. The riders could settle there and be themselves among others who understood them. They were far enough away from Fort that their mating flights wouldn't disturb anyone. These volcanoes the dragons lived in were called weirs. I will discuss more about the details of the weirs in a future episode. Now, since Fort was settled, things began to look up. Because of the rocky nature of their new home, threadfall could become harmless to the people themselves. Since they had a pretty good schedule and charts of when and where thread would fall, they were able to predict it and keep people indoors. The dragon riders could then keep Fort's cropland safe during threadfall by burning it out of the air before it landed. This meant that the settlers could begin to repopulate again. And as they repopulated and began to strain the resources of Fort, this meant that they had to start spreading out and looking for other places to settle. During an interval, when no thread fell upon Pern, was the perfect time to do so. And that'll have to end this episode, ladies and gentlemen. Starting next week, I'm going to talk about the 3 different types of authority which the Pernies set up for themselves, and go into as much detail as I possibly can to help describe them to you. I want to thank you all again for watching. Once again, I am Alex, also known as Solinus Dracone, and this has been my Pern Primer series, Part 4. Goodbye.